were some other roles of the Levites in the temple? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of 1 Chronicles on walking through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing 1 Chronicles chapter 9, verses 28 to 44. But before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to 1 Chronicles chapter 9, verse 28. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So 1 Chronicles chapter 9, beginning at verse 28. Now some of them were in charge of the serving vessels, for they brought them in and took them out by count. Some of them were appointed over the furnishings and over all the implements of the sanctuary and over the fine flour and the wine and the oil and the incense and the spices. And some of the sons of the priests made ointment of the spices. Mittaniah of the Levites, the firstborn of Shallum, the Korite, had the trusted office over the things that were baked in the pans. And some of their brethren of the sons of the Kohathites were in charge of preparing the showbread for every Sabbath. These are the singers, the heads of the fathers' houses of the Levites, who lodged in the chambers and were free from other duties, for they were employed in that work day and night. These heads of the fathers' houses of the Levites were heads throughout their generation. They dwelt at Jerusalem. Jeiel, the father of Gibeon, whose wife's name was Maacah, dwelt in Gibeon. His firstborn was Abdon, then Zur, Kish, Baal, Ner, Nadab, Gedor, Ahio, Zechariah, and Mikloth. And Mikloth begat Shimeam. They also dwelt alongside their relatives in Jerusalem with their brethren. Ner begot Kish, Kish begot Saul, and Saul begot Jonathan, Malchishua, Abinadab, and Eshbaal. The son of Jonathan was Merabaal, and Merabaal begot Micah. The sons of Micah were Pithon, Melech, Teriah, and Ahaz. And Ahaz begot Jerah. Jerah begot Elemath, Asmaveth, and Zimri. And Zimri begot Mazzah. Mazzah begot Beniah, Raphiah, his son, Eleasah, his son, and Azel, his son. And Azel had 6 sons, whose names were these: Azrikam, Bakaru, Ishmael, Shariah, Obadiah, and Hanan. These were the sons of Azel. In this chapter, we have learned that there's much more to temple work than offering sacrifices and preparing sacrifices. We already learned that there were singers for the temple worship, and in this chapter we find that the singers' work was so encompassing that they were exempt from other duties that might have arisen. Why? Think about it. They had to compose psalms of worship, some of which we have in the book of Psalms. They had to put them to music, practice and rehearse them, and then sing them in the temple worship. That is a big job, one that required a lot of time, thus the exemption. We learned in the last lesson that there were gatekeepers for the temple, not only for holding open and closing the doors, but to ensure that only the right people went into certain places on the temple grounds, like only the priests who went into the temple structure itself to perform their duties. These gatekeepers, like the singers, would have been Levites tasked for this service. And this service would have been rotational, as was alluded to earlier in the chapter and made much more explicit later on in this book by David. Coming now to verse 28, we find that there were other roles. There were those who were appointed over the furnishings and over the implements of the temple. These would have been the vessels that were put into the service in the temple. All of them wouldn't be out at once, for they all weren't being used. Thus, somebody needed to bring them out and take them back in. Someone needed to make sure that they were cleaned properly. The priests were too busy for that, and so there were Levites appointed to that service. The fine flour, the wine, the oil, the incense, and the spices used for sacrifices needed to be obtained and prepared. Some of this had to be prepared by the priests themselves, according to the law of Moses, but for those things that didn't require priestly oversight, others could be employed to look after those needs. The showbread that was used in the temple needed to be made. Some of the brethren of the sons of Kohath were put in charge of that. As you can see then, the transition from the tabernacle to the temple brought with it more work for the Levites to do than may have been needed in the past. More workers needed to be had, and rotations for service in the temple needed to be organized, or things would go undone. Much is the same on a different level in the church today. All Christians are priests, and thus all have a role to do. No, not all of us will be preachers and teachers, song leaders, and ones who lead around the Lord's table. But we are to participate in worship. We are all to assist where possible in the work of the church, whether that's through making communion bread, handing out religious material, talking with friends about Jesus, helping the poor and sick, being hospitable. You name it. If God wants it to be done, each of us can do our part. And each of us needs to do our part, for if we do, not only will we grow, but the church will grow as well. In verses 35 to 44, what we have is an almost exact repeat of the lineage of King Saul, found in chapter 8, verses 29 to 38. Why the repeat? Well, in chapter 8, this lineage is introduced in relation to the genealogies of the tribe of Benjamin. Here in chapter 9, though, it is introduced again due to the fact that King Saul is going to be discussed in chapter 10. Thus, the end of chapter 9 serves as an introduction to chapter 10. The main difference between the genealogies of chapter 8 and 9 is here in chapter 9, the father of Gibeon is given a name, Jael, whereas chapter 8 simply refers to him as the father of Gibeon, meaning the chief of Gibeon. As for the rest, it is largely the same. If you want a further discussion of this list, we refer you back to lesson 24 in this series, which can be found at eastendchurch.org under the media pull-down menu and the WTTB English podcast link. In our next lesson, we're going to cover the reign of King Saul, but not in its entirety, for the chronicler is really only going to cover Saul's death as a segue into the reign of King David. So we invite you back for that. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 1 Chronicles chapter 10, verses 1 to 14, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.